The fog hung thick over Puget Sound that October morning in 1944. 23 German soldiers stood on a maintenance dock, their work tools gripped in trembling hands. They'd been brought here to repair fencing, clear some debris, nothing special, just another work detail for prisoners of war stuck thousands of miles from home. But when that fog started lifting just after dawn, everything changed. What emerged from those gray waters made grown men drop their hammers and wrenches. Ships. Not just a few ships, but an entire fleet stretching from one horizon to the other. Destroyers, cruisers, aircraft carriers, supply vessels. More warships than these men had ever seen in one place. More than they believed any nation on Earth could build. The vessels sat in perfect rows, their gray hulls catching the pale Washington morning light, while smaller craft zipped between them like fish attending to whales. These weren't just any prisoners staring at that fleet. These were men who'd been told America was weak, men who'd been promised their U-boats would starve the United States before it could ever threaten the Reich, men who genuinely believed German engineering was untouchable. And now they stood there, watching their entire worldview crumble into the cold Pacific waters. One of them, a sergeant named Muller who'd served in the German Navy, began to shake. Not from the October chill, from the sudden gut-wrenching realization that everything he'd been told was a lie. This is the story of the day the war ended for 23 German prisoners, months before Berlin fell. This is about the moment they saw America's true power and understood with absolute certainty that Germany had already lost. To understand how these men ended up on that dock, we need to go back to 1943. The North African campaign had just collapsed for the Axis powers, and suddenly the Allies had a massive problem on their hands. Over 275,000 German and Italian soldiers had surrendered, more prisoners than anyone knew what to do with. Britain was getting pounded by bombing raids and couldn't house that many enemy troops, so the decision was made to ship them across the Atlantic to America. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. These German soldiers who'd been told the U-boats controlled the Atlantic were now sailing safely across that same ocean on American and British ships. Some traveled on converted luxury liners like the Queen Mary, which had been turned into troop transports. They crossed an ocean their own navy was supposed to have locked down, and not a single U-boat touched them. That should have been the first clue. They arrived at ports from New York to New Orleans, then got loaded onto trains headed inland. The German prisoners watched America roll past their windows for days. Farms, factories, cities, more farms, more factories. The scale of it all was staggering. This wasn't the struggling nation their propaganda had described. This was something else entirely. Fort Lewis near Tacoma, Washington became one of the main receiving centers for prisoners headed to the Pacific Northwest. At its peak, several thousand Germans were housed there in compounds built right next to the main training facilities. They lived in wooden barracks that had previously held American troops. Clean, heated, decent conditions. Nothing like the prison camps they'd heard about or expected. And then there was the food. Letters from German prisoners that were intercepted by military censors tell the story better than anything else. One corporal wrote to his brother back in Hamburg, and I'm paraphrasing here because we can't read the whole thing, but he basically said the Americans were feeding them fresh eggs, real coffee, actual meat that wasn't canned or spoiled. He'd gained weight since being captured. He wrote that Americans didn't understand hunger because they'd never experienced it. Think about that for a second. These were enemy soldiers, prisoners of war, and they were eating better than most German civilians back home, better than they'd eaten in their own army. Under the Geneva Convention, prisoners were supposed to get the same rations as the troops guarding them, and America actually followed that rule. Scrambled eggs, toast, bacon, coffee. For men who'd survived the Eastern Front or the desert campaigns in North Africa, these portions seemed almost obscene. But here's what really messed with their heads. They weren't being worked to death or starved or beaten. They got paid 80 cents a day for their labor. There were camp commissaries where they could buy chocolate bars and Coca-Cola with their earnings. Chocolate. In the middle of a war. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. Daily life at Fort Lewis followed a strict but not cruel routine. Prisoners woke at 6 a.m. to the same bugle calls that roused American soldiers. They ate breakfast, attended roll call, then headed out to whatever work assignments they'd been given. Most of the time, that meant agricultural work. Washington's farms needed hands to bring in wheat, apples, and hops, especially with so many American men overseas fighting. Other prisoners got assigned to forestry details in the Cascade foothills, cutting timber that would eventually become lumber for the war effort. Some worked maintenance jobs, painting buildings, repairing equipment, clearing brush. The Geneva Convention was pretty clear about what kind of work prisoners could do. Nothing that directly supported combat operations, but general labor was fair game. The camps themselves were their own little worlds. There were tensions, of course. Hardcore Nazis versus regular soldiers who just wanted the war to end. Some prisoners still believed in the Reich, still thought Germany would somehow pull off a miracle victory. Others had already accepted defeat in their hearts, even if they couldn't say it out loud. The camp administration kept close watch on these dynamics, separating troublemakers when necessary. But what the American authorities really paid attention to were the work assignments near the coast. See, prisoners who were deemed psychologically stable and low security risk could be transported to areas near military installations for maintenance work. These jobs required them to be close to sensitive areas, even if they weren't supposed to see or access classified operations. The key word there is supposed to. The thing about Puget Sound in 1944 was that you couldn't be anywhere near the water without seeing ships. The Bremerton Naval Shipyard alone was servicing over 300 vessels during the war. Add in facilities at Seattle, Tacoma, and smaller ports, and you had a maritime industrial complex stretching for miles along the inland waters. Ships were constantly arriving, departing, getting repaired. Aircraft from Naval Air Station Seattle flew overhead constantly. The machinery of Pacific warfare was visible from almost any vantage point. The War Department knew exactly what they were doing. A memo from September 1944, now sitting in the National Archives, basically admitted that exposing prisoners to evidence of American industrial and military capacity had demonstrated positive effects on prisoner morale and compliance. In other words, when prisoners saw what America could actually produce, they became a lot more cooperative and a lot less ideological. The memo recommended expanding these visual demonstration programs to more prisoner populations. So when Sergeant Muller and 22 other prisoners got loaded onto trucks in October 1944 for a maintenance detail at the Bremerton Naval Shipyard perimeter, it wasn't entirely by accident. Someone somewhere in the chain of command knew exactly what those men were about to witness. October 1944. The war in Europe had turned decisively against Germany, though the prisoners at Fort Lewis only got bits and pieces of news. Censored letters from home, carefully edited radio broadcasts, rumors passed between work details. They knew things weren't going well, but knowing and truly understanding are two different things. The trucks rolled out from Fort Lewis early that morning, making the 60-mile journey south to Bremerton. The prisoners sat in the back, watching the Washington countryside roll past. Dense forests, small towns, glimpses of water through the trees. Most of them had made this trip before for similar work details. Repair some fencing, clear some debris, paint a building or two. Standard stuff. They had no idea this day would be different. Muller sat near the back, quiet as usual. Before the war, he'd served in the Kriegsmarine, the German Navy. He'd seen the great battleships Bismarck and Tirpitz, had been taught that German naval engineering was the finest in the world. He'd believed it too. Why wouldn't he? Everything in his training, everything in the propaganda, had reinforced that belief. German ships were superior. German tactics were better. The Allies couldn't possibly match their capabilities. When the trucks arrived at the Bremerton Naval Shipyard, the fog was still thick. The prisoners couldn't see much beyond 100 feet or so. They were assigned to a maintenance dock on the perimeter, away from the main operational areas. Standard security protocol. They got their tools, received their instructions from the American guards, and started working on the fencing that needed repair. The fog started lifting around dawn. Slowly at first, just thinning out a bit here and there. And then, as if someone had pulled back a curtain, it cleared. What they saw made every single one of them stop working. Tools fell from hands. Conversations died mid-sentence. 23 men stood frozen, staring out at Puget Sound. The American fleet stretched from horizon to horizon. Not a dozen ships, not 50 ships, hundreds of ships. Destroyers sat in neat rows, their sleek hulls designed for speed and combat. Cruisers bristled with guns. Aircraft carriers, massive floating cities, their flight decks longer than entire German vessels. Supply ships, tankers, repair vessels, everything you'd need to sustain a naval campaign across the entire Pacific Ocean. Muller's hands started shaking. He'd seen ships before, had served on them, understood naval power. But this was beyond anything he'd imagined. The sheer number alone was staggering, but it was more than that. These ships looked operational, maintained, ready. This wasn't a fleet being assembled. This was a fleet that had already been assembled and was now being serviced, repaired, and sent back out to continue the war. An American guard lit a cigarette and watched the prisoners' reactions. He'd seen this before, had witnessed other German work details go through the same psychological shock. He didn't say anything. Sometimes silence was more effective than any words. One of the younger prisoners, barely 20 years old, turned to Muller and asked in German what it meant. Muller didn't answer right away. He couldn't, because what it meant was that everything they'd been told, everything they'd believed about American weakness and German superiority had been a lie. And if that was a lie, what else had been a lie? The propaganda about the Jewish conspiracy, the promises of ultimate victory, the entire ideological foundation of the Reich. The fog had lifted, and with it, any remaining illusions these men had about winning the war. As the prisoners stood there processing what they were seeing, work shifts were changing at the shipyard. The civilian workforce started streaming through the gates, thousands of them, heading to their stations for another day of building America's war machine. And what the German prisoners saw walking through those gates challenged everything Nazi ideology had taught them. Women in welding gear walked alongside men, carrying the same tools, wearing the same protective clothing, heading to the same jobs. Not women doing clerical work or nursing. Women operating cranes, welding hull plates, riveting steel. The Kaiser shipyards in Seattle employed over 40,000 workers at peak production, and a huge portion of them were women. Rosie the Riveter wasn't just a poster. She was real, and she was building the ships that would defeat the Axis powers. But it wasn't just the women that shocked the prisoners. Black workers operated cranes right alongside white workers. Chinese and Filipino Americans worked the docks. The workforce was as diverse as America itself. All these different races and backgrounds working together toward a common goal. For men who'd been indoctrinated with Nazi racial theories, who'd been taught that such cooperation was impossible, that inferior races couldn't build anything of value, this scene was deeply disturbing to their worldview. A German lieutenant who'd studied industrial engineering in Munich before the war observed this for 3 days straight. He'd been trained to believe in German racial superiority, that only Aryan peoples could achieve industrial excellence. On the 4th day, according to a guard report filed in October 1944, he approached his American escort with a question that clearly troubled him deeply. "How do you make them work together?" he asked. "We were told your races cannot cooperate." The American guard, a sergeant from Oregon who'd worked in a lumber mill before the war, thought about the question for a moment. His answer was simple, almost matter-of-fact. "Nobody asks what color you are when you're building a ship," he said. "They just ask if you can weld." The lieutenant didn't say anything more, but witnesses noted he was a lot quieter than usual for the rest of the assignment. That one interaction, that one simple answer, had punctured years of ideological conditioning, because what the guard said was undeniably true. These diverse workers were building ships, lots of ships, better and faster than Germany ever could. The proof was floating right there in Puget Sound. Over the next few hours, as the work detail continued, the prisoners got a closer look at what was actually in that harbor. And the more they saw, the worse it got for their psychological state. The USS Saratoga glided past the dock, an aircraft carrier that had just completed repairs. Her flight deck stretched nearly 900 feet, with planes parked on the surface in neat rows, dozens of them, wings folded like sleeping birds. The carrier moved with quiet confidence, attended by tugboats that looked like toys beside its bulk. The battleship USS Colorado sat in dry dock nearby, undergoing refitting after Pacific combat. Its hull showed the wear of battle, burn marks, and patched areas where enemy fire had struck. But American workers were already strengthening it, upgrading its guns, preparing it for more fighting. A ship that had been damaged in combat was being turned around and sent back out. That kind of industrial resilience was something the prisoners had never considered possible. But here's what really drove the point home. It wasn't the big ships that told the full story. It was the small ones. Destroyer escorts, submarine chasers, landing craft, vessels the German prisoners had been told were in desperately short supply for the Americans. These ships seemed to multiply daily. One morning there'd be a dozen destroyer escorts at anchor. The next morning there'd be 20. They were being produced faster than the eye could track. A military intelligence report from December 1944 noted that German naval personnel among the prisoner population had expressed particular astonishment at the volume of American small craft production. Several prisoners had made unprompted statements indicating what the report called a fundamental revision of prior assumptions regarding American industrial capacity. One statement, preserved in an interrogation transcript, came from a former U-boat crewman who'd been captured in the Atlantic. His words, paraphrased because we can't quote the whole thing, essentially said they'd been told Germany was winning the tonnage war. They'd been assured that American shipyards couldn't keep pace with German submarine attacks. But standing there watching the American fleet, he realized the truth. America was building ships faster than U-boats could sink them. The tonnage war wasn't close. It was a slaughter, and Germany was on the losing end. Another prisoner, an artillery officer from the Eastern Front, did some quick mental calculations based on what he was seeing. If this was just one American naval shipyard, and there were dozens of such facilities around the country, then the total production capacity was beyond anything Germany could match. He'd been in the Wehrmacht long enough to know German production numbers. They couldn't even come close to this scale. The war, these men were beginning to understand, hadn't been lost in some recent battle or strategic mistake. The war had been lost before it even began, lost in the industrial capacity that Germany simply never had and could never develop. They'd been fighting against an opponent who could absorb losses, rebuild fleets, and keep producing at levels that made victory impossible. Muller stood there watching an aircraft carrier move past, and he thought about all the young German sailors still fighting in the Atlantic, still believing they were making a difference. He thought about the U-boat crews hunting American convoys, thinking they were strangling Allied supply lines. And he realized they were all dying for nothing, because America could replace every ship they sank and more. The truth was right there in front of them, undeniable and overwhelming. Midday came, and the prisoners were given their lunch break. Sandwiches, apples, coffee, all provided by the Army. They sat on the dock eating, though most of them had lost their appetite. How do you eat when your entire understanding of reality has just been shattered? They picked at their food, stared at the ships, and tried to process what they were seeing. A work crew from the shipyard passed nearby, also on break. American workers sat on crates eating from lunch pails, talking and laughing about whatever shipyard workers talk about. Normal people doing normal things, building weapons of war as casually as if they were making furniture. One of the workers, a middle-aged woman with graying hair beneath her welding cap, noticed the German prisoners watching. She walked over to the fence that separated the work areas. The guards tensed slightly, but didn't intervene. She wasn't doing anything threatening, just approaching the fence line. She reached into her lunch pail and pulled out a photograph, holding it up so the prisoners could see through the chain link. "My son," she said, pointing at the image. It showed a young man in navy dress whites, probably 19 or 20 years old, with that optimistic smile young men wear before they've seen combat. "He's on a destroyer somewhere in the Pacific. You got any kids?" The question hung in the air for a moment. One of the German prisoners, after hesitating, nodded slowly. He reached into his own pocket and produced a worn photograph, edges frayed from being handled too many times. A young girl, maybe 6 years old, smiled at the camera from some German backyard that now felt impossibly far away. "My daughter," the prisoner said quietly, his English broken but understandable. "Heidelberg. I have not seen her in 3 years." The woman looked at the photograph, really looked at it. Then she looked at the prisoner. Something passed between them in that moment, something the war couldn't touch. Not forgiveness, nothing that simple, not friendship, because they were still enemies by every official definition, but recognition, human recognition. The war had made them enemies. The war had put this man on one side of a fence and this woman on the other. The war had sent her son and possibly sent this man's daughter's father into combat. But the war had also made them both parents separated from children by forces larger than either of them could control. They were both trapped in the same massive machinery of conflict, just on different gears. "I hope you see her again," the woman said. Her voice was quiet, sincere. Then she tucked the photo back into her lunch pail, returned to her crew, and resumed her work. Building ships, building the very weapons that were being used against her son's enemies, which included this man's country and maybe this man's former comrades. The German prisoner stood there holding his daughter's photograph for a long time after the woman left. Other prisoners had witnessed the exchange. Nobody said anything. What was there to say? That the enemy wasn't entirely faceless? That Americans were human beings with families and fears just like them? They'd known that intellectually, but seeing it, experiencing that brief moment of connection, made it real in a way propaganda could never touch. The guards let the moment stand. Sometimes in war, the most powerful lessons come from the smallest interactions. The work detail was nearly finished. Late afternoon shadows stretched across the dock as the prisoners prepared to load onto the trucks for the return journey to Fort Lewis. They'd spent the entire day working within sight of that fleet, and every single one of them had been changed by the experience. You don't watch your worldview collapse and walk away the same person. Then the sun broke through the autumn clouds. Puget Sound lit up in shades of gold and copper, the gray warship suddenly touched with warm light. The water sparkled like someone had scattered diamonds across its surface. To the west, the Olympic Mountains rose with their peaks already white with early snow, standing as they had for millennia, indifferent to the human conflicts playing out below them. The prisoners stood by the trucks, unable to move. This should have been a moment of beauty, of peace. The kind of sunset people write poetry about, the kind of scene that reminds you why life is worth living. But for these men, that beautiful light was illuminating the instrument of their nation's destruction, the greatest naval armada ever assembled, painted in colors that belonged to peacetime, to hope, to futures that might exist when the guns finally stopped. An American sergeant noticed that Muller, the former German naval man, was weeping. Not sobbing, not making any sound. Just tears running silently down his weathered face, catching the sunset light as they fell. The sergeant approached him, concerned. These prisoners were his responsibility, and a breakdown could complicate the return journey. "You okay?" the sergeant asked. Muller wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, took a breath, and looked at the American guard. When he spoke, his voice was quiet but steady, the voice of a man who just accepted a terrible truth. "I am okay," he said in careful English. "But Germany is not. Germany will never be okay again." The sergeant didn't know what to say to that. What could he say? That Germany would recover? That everything would work out? They both knew better. They'd both seen too much. So the sergeant just nodded, acknowledging the statement without agreeing or disagreeing. Sometimes witness is enough. The trucks started their engines, the sound breaking the moment. The prisoners climbed aboard, taking their positions for the long ride back to Fort Lewis. As the convoy pulled away, Muller took one last look at the fleet sitting in the fading light. Patient, immense, unstoppable. That image would stay with him for the rest of his life. Not the ships themselves, but what they represented. The crushing, undeniable proof that Germany had built its entire ideology on lies. They'd been told they were superior. They'd been promised victory was destiny. They'd believed that will and racial purity could overcome any obstacle. And then reality had showed up in the form of a fleet built by diverse workers, powered by industrial capacity beyond imagination, and operated by a nation that hadn't even fully mobilized yet. That was the truly terrifying part. America was doing all this while still maintaining a civilian economy, still producing consumer goods, still feeding its people in abundance. Germany had converted everything to war production and still couldn't match it. The sunset faded, the trucks rolled on, and 23 men rode in silence, each of them carrying the weight of what they'd witnessed. The autumn rains came early to Washington that year, sweeping in from the Pacific on winds that bent the Douglas firs and drummed against the barracks windows at Fort Lewis. The prisoners settled back into their routines, indoor work details during the worst weather, language classes for those who wanted to learn English, letter writing, carefully censored by military authorities. The quiet, suspended existence of men waiting for a war to end. But something had changed in the men who'd seen the fleet. Military intelligence was monitoring prisoner correspondence and conversations, looking for useful information, tracking morale and psychological states. They noticed a marked shift in tone among those who participated in the coastal work details. A report from January 1945 observed that prisoners who'd witnessed the Puget Sound naval installations demonstrated significantly reduced ideological commitment and increased willingness to discuss post-war reconstruction. In plain language, seeing that fleet had broken something in these men. The Nazi ideology couldn't survive contact with reality. Once you'd seen proof that everything you'd been told was a lie, it was hard to keep believing. The report recommended expanding these visual exposure programs to additional prisoner populations. But the recommendation came too late to matter much. By spring of 1945, Germany was collapsing in real time. The Rhine had been crossed. Soviet forces were closing on Berlin. The prisoners at Fort Lewis listened to radio broadcasts in their barracks, following the final convulsions of the Reich they'd served. On May 8, 1945, the camp loudspeakers announced Germany's unconditional surrender. VE Day, victory in Europe. The war was over. The prisoners gathered in the compound, their reactions mixed. Many of them wept. Some stood in stunned silence, unable to process what they were hearing. Others felt quietly relieved that the dying was finally finished, that no more young men would burn in tanks or drown in submarines or bleed out in fields. For those who'd seen the American fleet back in October, the announcement carried no surprise. They'd understood the war's outcome months earlier. Standing on a dock in Bremerton, watching ships that no propaganda could explain away. They'd known since that moment that Germany would surrender. The only question had been when and how much more destruction would happen first. Repatriation began slowly. The logistics of returning hundreds of thousands of men to a shattered continent took time and careful organization. Some Fort Lewis prisoners departed in late 1945. Others remained until 1946, continuing to work agricultural details as they waited for transportation home. They knew what they were returning to. Letters from family members described cities in ruins, the economy destroyed, food shortages, occupation zones carved out by the victorious powers. They returned to a Germany divided between American, British, French, and Soviet zones. A Germany that would remain divided for the next 45 years. They found their families, if their families had survived. They tried to rebuild lives in a nation that had been rebuilt from scratch. The reconstruction would take decades. Some of the former prisoners contributed to that reconstruction, carrying with them skills they'd learned in American camps and memories of industrial capacity that had reshaped their understanding of what was possible. Muller, the former Marine sergeant who'd wept at sunset, disappears from the historical record after his repatriation in 1946. His fate, like that of so many, is unknown. Perhaps he found his way back to whatever remained of his family. Perhaps he helped rebuild the German merchant marine in the post-war years. Perhaps he simply lived out his years in quiet anonymity, carrying memories that no one else could fully understand. Did he ever tell his story? Did he ever describe what he saw that October day to his children or grandchildren? Did those memories haunt him, or did they eventually fade into the background noise of a long life? We'll never know. The war took so many stories with it, left so many questions unanswered. The Puget Sound Naval Shipyard at Bremerton never stopped operating. After World War II ended, it transitioned to Cold War operations, servicing the submarines and carriers that would face off against the Soviet Union. Today, more than 75 years later, it's still active, maintaining the nuclear submarines and aircraft carriers that make up modern American naval power. The dry docks that serviced World War II battleships now accommodate vessels that the German prisoners of 1944 couldn't have imagined even in their wildest dreams. Fort Lewis merged with McChord Air Force Base in 2010 to form Joint Base Lewis-McChord. The POW compounds were demolished decades ago. No markers indicate where German prisoners once lived, worked, and watched the fleet that convinced them of their defeat. The land has been repurposed, built over, absorbed back into the ordinary operations of a military base. History doesn't leave plaques for every significant moment, but the waters of Puget Sound still catch the morning light as they did in October 1944. The fog still lifts to reveal ships at anchor. The Olympic Mountains still rise to the west, their peaks white with snow. Some things endure beyond the wars that pass across them. The geography remains. The beauty remains. The capacity for human beings to build both terrible and magnificent things remains. Those German prisoners who stood on that dock came from a nation that had believed its own mythology. They'd believed in racial destiny, in industrial superiority, in the certainty of victory. What they saw in America challenged every single assumption. The diverse workforce that supposedly couldn't cooperate, the impossible production that supposedly couldn't be achieved. The fleet that rose from the water like a steel forest, undeniable proof that the world didn't work the way they'd been told. They had expected to find weakness. They found strength of a kind they'd never imagined. And in finding it, they began the long, painful process of understanding that the world was larger, more powerful,